Astronauts to the moon.
Ignition sequence start. 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we have a problem.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue.
What you're seeing here is a mirage.
So, what does this have to do with George Herbert Walker Bush? Well, if you've ever seen Bush talk about his recollection of the Kennedy assassination, it's definitely interesting. First, let's see him talk about it here at Gerald Ford's funeral.
Time and again, he would step forward and keep his promise, even when the dark clouds of political crisis gathered over America. After a deluded gunman assassinated President Kennedy.
Did I miss the funny part? What is funny about a deluded gunman?
After a deluded gunman assassinated President Kennedy. After a deluded gunman assassinated President Kennedy.
Well, a smile certainly does say it all, huh? So where was George Herbert Walker Bush on that now infamous November day? Well, Russ Baker has done some of the best research on the whereabouts of George Bush and wrote the book Family of Secrets. He talks about that famous day here.
Somebody had asked him very innocuously, where were you the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated? And they expected he would tell them some heartwarming or some touching or at least interesting story. And instead he said, gosh, where was I? I just can't remember. And I thought, well, that has to be the strangest darn thing. In fact, let me ask you, anybody here who was 5 years old or over November 22, 1963, how many of you do not remember where you were that day?
So, does anyone watching, born prior to 1960, not recall where they were when John F. Kennedy was shot on November 22nd, 1963?
Note for the record, not a hand has gone up. So, see, he either has a really, really bad memory or there's something else going on. Now, I was fascinated by that, and so during the 5 years I researched Family of Secrets, I ran multiple research tracks, and one of them that I spent a full 5 years on was trying to answer this thing. Why could he not remember where he was, and where was he? Well, the answer to that is contained in 4 chapters in Family of Secrets. It may be the most explosive material in the book, and they're all facts, they're all documented, you can do what you will with them. I'll just give you a few of them just to sort of whet your appetite. On November 22, 1963, Poppy Bush, the man who later could not remember where he was, there is a declassified FBI memo from J. Edgar Hoover, and it references the Kennedy assassination, and it talks about a briefing on November 23 dealing with the assassination and Cuban exiles. Excuse me. And in this memo, it says that they were liaising with representatives of 2 other intelligence agencies, the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA, and it names both of those people. The representative of the CIA related to the Kennedy assassination was George Bush. That's the name in there. Now, some years later, when that document first surfaced, Bush denied that was him. The CIA would not comment because they never comment about personnel. But this document first emerged when Bush was about to be crowned the Republican nominee for president, and so you would think that might be slightly interesting. So the CIA, apparently pressured by Bush, released a statement saying, oh, no, that wasn't him, that was another George Bush, and they identified this fellow, and they said, but we don't know where he is, we can't find him. Well, that tells you something about how competent the agency is, because a journalist who lives right here in town, I'm trying to think, was it Okoka? There were 2 different journalists from San Francisco, interestingly, who were the only people who followed up on this memo and another memo I'm about to tell you about, a guy named Joe McBride, I don't know, maybe Joe's here, and a fellow named Miguel Okoka. So when they contacted this fellow, he said, that wasn't me. And in fact, the story of the other George Bush in itself is so fascinating. This is this world of mirrors that we don't really see. We all rush out to buy the pot boilers and the made-up stories, but the real stuff is absolutely as good or better. This George Bush was this fellow who wasn't even in government, and he was recruited by the CIA in 1963, put into a low-level training position. He said he never had any briefings on anything. He worked there for a few months, until shortly after the assassination, and they got rid of him. So he was only employed by them exactly in this period where the other George Bush could not remember where he was. In any case, so that memo is one memo. The same guy couldn't remember where he was. According to this, he was a CIA agent having something to do with Cuban exiles and information about the Kennedy assassination. There's another memo that has come to light, and this one is relating to actually November 22 itself. On 1:45 p.m., according to this FBI memo, a phone call was received at the FBI's office in Houston, strangely enough, not in Dallas, where the shooting took place. The man who called identified himself as George H.W. Bush, this time with his initials, and he gave his home address, and he said, I'm from Zapata Offshore, which was his company, and he said, I'm calling with possible information on who shot President Kennedy. Okay, now this is the same person who years later was president of the United States and couldn't remember where he was. So now we've got him not remembering where he was. We have him working for the CIA in one memo, and in the other one we have him being a private citizen and an oilman calling a different FBI office to say, I'd like to offer a tip. He identifies a fellow. He says, I've heard that he may have been threatening the president. I really don't know much about this man, but good luck with that. By the way, I'm calling from Tyler, Texas. It's 1:45 p.m. Put that in your records. So I started studying what it meant to be in Tyler, Texas at 1:45 p.m. when the shooting was at 12:30 and so forth. I later found in Barbara Bush. Now, we all know Barbara Bush is a very sweet lady and would never do anything bad. But Barbara Bush in 93, 94, right after they'd left the White House, she published her memoirs. And in her memoirs, she suddenly remembers for Poppy where they were on November 22. She puts in a purported letter that she had been writing that day to her family, where she's under a hairdryer in Tyler, Texas, and she hears the horrible news that the president has been shot. I study that letter, and I suggest in Family of Secrets that that may not be a real letter, because she addresses it Dear Family, and we tried to figure it out. There didn't seem to be anybody who that could have been addressed to. It was not written to her children. She was estranged from her own family. We could not figure who that was. And in that letter, she drops little hints of things, but she misspells all of the names. So I think what's going on here is that if somebody like me should ever come along and start putting the pieces together, and we say, hey, what about this? They could say, hey, we were open about it. I said I had lunch with Doris Ulmer. But what she doesn't say is, who's Doris Ulmer? Now, I went and I studied, and I found all the Doris Ulmers in America, and I figured out who it was. Her husband, and it says, Dear Family, I had lunch with Doris Ulmer. You may remember that her husband was so kind to George when he was in Greece. So I thought, well, when was he in Greece? And what was he doing in Greece? And how did he know this man? So I tried to figure out who her husband was. His name was Al Ulmer, and he was one of the CIA station chiefs in charge of removing leaders of countries. And he was living abroad, but he just happened to visit the Dallas area that week. Okay. Anyway, I've got, as I say, 4 chapters. This isn't time to go through all that, but I hope you find that interesting. I tried to write Family of Secrets in a way where I just lay out these facts. They're all documented. They're really indisputable. By the way, if you've been online, you've seen some of the reviews. I've been attacked for providing these facts. Los Angeles Times said that anybody who even questions the official Lee Harvey Oswald story, what did the term he used? You have to question their state of mental health, I believe he said. This despite the fact that the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s actually concluded in their report the high probability that there was a conspiracy. This is Congress concluding that. They just couldn't figure out who did it.
So I know you're asking me, what does this have to do with Philip Graham? And I'm almost there. If you don't know, many people have already connected Bush to the Kennedy killing. These photos certainly appear to be George Herbert Walker Bush standing outside the Texas School Book Depository immediately after Kennedy was shot. But there is no record of Bush working in the CIA at that time. George Bush is one of the very few people who cannot recall where he was at the time of the assassination. He was 39 years old at the time and chairman of the Harris County Republican Party and an outspoken critic of JFK. But on November 21, 1963, he was staying at the Sheraton Hotel in downtown Dallas and spoke that very evening to the American Association of Oil Drilling Contractors. Sometime later, he was also reported at the ratification meeting at the home of Clint Murchison Sr., receiving last-minute instructions and toasting JFK's murder the night before it happened. For that info, see Madeline Duncan Brown, who wrote the book Texas in the Morning. It was corroborated by Nigel Turner in Part 9 of The Guilty Men of the Men Who Killed Kennedy. George Bush was more than likely recruited in his college days at Yale when he was part of the Skull and Bones Society, and he and his wife Barbara moved to Houston, where he ran an offshore drilling company, Zapata Offshore Company, which was a CIA front with rigs located all around the world, making it very easy for him to vanish for weeks at a time on CIA business that no one would ask what he was doing. Bush was a major organizer and recruiter of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was codenamed Operation Zapata. Colonel Fletcher Prouty, former Pentagon high-ranking official, who was the basis for the Colonel X character in Oliver Stone's JFK, obtained 2 Navy ships for the operation that were repainted to non-Navy colors and then renamed Houston and Barbara. This FBI memo dated 22nd of November 1963 states that Bush called from Tyler, Texas, but that is no proof that he was actually there. The memo, however, does tell us that the first moment that Bush had to create a phony alibi was at 1:45 p.m. Bush was staying in a downtown Dallas Sheraton Hotel just blocks away from Dealey Plaza, yet he's trying to tell us that he was in Tyler, Texas at 1:45. Bush's CIA assignment was in Dallas. That's why he was staying there. So what would he have been doing in Tyler, Texas? JFK had been shot at 12:30 p.m. Would Bush not have been in Dallas at 12:30 p.m. as well, like everyone else, which was presumably the reason for having him there in the first place, staying at the Dallas Sheraton Hotel? The alibi for November 22, 1963 is clearly fabricated, and we have evidence that shows he was there. That means that he was lying and probably an accessory to JFK's murder. Bush maintained for 20 years that he simply did not remember what he was doing at the time of the assassination, but all of a sudden, he then concocted a story that he was speaking in Tyler, Texas at a Rotary Club when he was told of JFK's death. Does anyone think that makes sense? That Bush was making a speech at that time in Tyler, Texas to the Rotary Club after the President and Governor Connally were already known to have been shot at 12:30 p.m.? President Kennedy had been scheduled to give a speech at lunchtime at the Dallas Trade Mart after he had passed through Dealey Plaza. So everyone who was anyone around Dallas was going to either attend that speech or they had already heard about the shootings and were paying attention to local news concerning the gravely wounded president and governor. A speech being given in Tyler, Texas, inside of a building owned by right-wingers to a group of Republican JFK haters hardly qualifies as evidence that Bush was not in Dallas, Texas, where the available evidence suggests that he was on assignment for the CIA and was supervising the second-floor Dowtex hit team. An FBI memo from Director J. Edgar Hoover, discovered by John McBride in 1988, but written just 7 days after the assassination, provides the verification that George H.W. Bush was an officer of the CIA in 1963 and was provided with updates on an anti-Castro Cubans. George Bush has said this memo was referring to another George Bush, because he didn't work for the CIA at that time. But while there was another man by that name, that other man was a file clerk, and would not have been receiving memorandums about the Bay of Pigs operation. And other information has surfaced showing that George Bush in the document was indeed George H.W. Bush and had the same address. In 1976, President Ford appointed George Bush as director of the CIA, replacing William Colby. Bush served in that role for 357 days from 30th of January 1976 to the 20th of January 1977. Bush falsely testified before Congress that he had never worked for the CIA, and it was widely reported that this was the first time that a civilian would be appointed to run the agency. But George Bush was no civilian, and it appears that he is a CIA lifer, probably recruited right out of Yale. George Bush was also a close friend with George de Mohrenschildt, including that they were both members of the Dallas Petroleum Club. And after de Mohrenschildt was found shot to death the day before he was to be questioned by Gaetan Fonzi for the HSCA reinvestigation of the deaths of JFK and MLK in the late 70s, Bush's name and address were found in de Mohrenschildt's address book. Bush, George H.W. Poppy, 1412 West Ohio, also Zapata Petroleum, Midland. CIA documents reveal that during the planning of the Bay of Pigs Operation Zapata, de Mohrenschildt made frequent trips to Mexico and Panama and gave reports to the CIA. His son-in-law told the Warren Commission that he believed de Mohrenschildt was spying for the planned Cuban invasion. George de Mohrenschildt notably was Lee Harvey Oswald's best friend and appears to have been his handler after Oswald was brought to Dallas in the fall of '63 when he was finding work at the Texas School Book Depository. So the facts are simple. John F. Kennedy died that day. It was a CIA hit with many of the Secret Service and other prominent businessmen and rich elite in the know. Lyndon B. Johnson knew he was to become president that day. It was a planned attack and carried out by several shooting squads, with fatal blows coming from the Dow Tex building and the curbside gutter. They then went through a massive cleanup to alter the autopsy to show the cause of death to be from a single shooter, the patsy, Lee Harvey Oswald. Whether Lee Harvey Oswald was killed or not, that I don't know, but Kennedy was killed. Somebody was in Dallas, Texas, orchestrating the hit, with several teams in several positions, plus cameramen ready to take pictures of shocked onlookers, and Zapruder, at the right place at the right time with the right equipment, gave us the right story they wanted to tell. It was definitely a planned attack, and somebody was there to oversee it all. And so what does this have to do with the death of Philip Graham? Well, it wasn't so much the death of Philip Graham as much as it was his funeral. As I was researching and trying to find out exactly whether Philip Graham was killed or whether he committed suicide or whether he had ever talked to Kennedy in those last final days, I found pictures of his funeral, which looks like just a normal funeral with Kennedy coming out until I looked a little closer. Now, I'm not saying I'm the first one to find this, but I've certainly never seen it before. The only image that I've ever seen that shows that George Bush may have been part of the CIA before the record or he states was that picture of him in front of the Texas School Book Depository. This picture, also from 1963,